Thanks so much for inviting me and having me. As Kuba said, I've been enjoying the series over the past couple of seasons. It's been a space where you really get to play with different ways that members of this community of people who like thinking about these things approach these questions. And let me just start slides. But thank you for inviting me, Kuba. Oops. Here we go. So, yeah. So today I'm taking a little bit a different angle, as I guess everyone has done in the series, looking at how the concept of knowledge is used in understanding different ways of what the university is in different sort of disciplinary theoretical groups. So the plan for today, I'm going to start with introducing a framework that I use in my dissertation research, and I like about thinking about ideas of the university through the work of Charles Mills, who talks about ideal theory as types of models. So it's kind of helpful for linking ideas of the university to a way to sort of analyze what they are as models. And then talking about the use of the concept of knowledge in ideas of the university from different disciplinary literatures, the philosophy of higher education, international higher education, and developmental higher education, and how they're used in those sort of discursive ways, and then how it's applied in development policy. And then as a sort of different layer, if we think about the concept of time, how that shifts the way we think about the concept of knowledge, academic knowledge. So how that might be understood as in a different way by thinking about time. And then sort of some implications I've thought of what these things might mean for the way we think about what the university is and what it's for. So as Kuba mentioned, I'm now at Aarhus University and I work with Søren Benston. And when Kuba invited me, I started thinking about, well, what does this question of ontology in the university mean for me? And the work that I'd done before stuck to pretty standard framings of what that was. And one of those, I think most of us are familiar with this phrase, knowledge for knowledge's sake. And Sun was like, well, what does knowledge for knowledge's sake even mean? And I was like, well, you can sort of like explain it through different people's framings, but something about that bothered me or like stuck with me or inspired me. Now, a caveat, I'm not going to answer this question in this presentation, but rather it's something that sparked the question of, well, how do we use the word knowledge or the concept of knowledge in ideas of the university? All right. So another caveat, I'm not trained as a philosopher. So my background is rather in the social sciences, in international higher education. And so I use different sort of theoretical framings to think about philosophical questions because I enjoy doing that. But I tend to use the framings that I have at present. So the tools I have at hand and the one that I relied on for this presentation was discourse analysis, which I use. And discourse analysis is a way of thinking about how language is used actively in society to influence, to structure, to govern, to control. And it relies on a more critical, realist view of society and what society is. So you see society as sort of subsystems with structures, and money and power can lend themselves to steering society and disconnect it from something that involves more communication, a more wholesome social life world. So another aspect of that, which connects, I think, ontology to discourse, or what reality is, or what the world is, or what you might think about what the university is this concept of the double hermeneutic effect. So it's basically an assumption that there's a performative relationship, not in the superficial sense, but in the sense that one thing affects the other, between theory and policy. So what we do as academics in theory, in our work, shapes policy in real policy contexts, and that in turn shapes real institutions. So there's this link or this assumption that the way we use language in discourse has real effects on society and vice versa. The society also affects the way we theorize. So that's sort of the basis that I'm starting with. So just to share a couple of the tools that I plan to use today when I think about the way the concept of knowledge is used. In discourse analysis, we have what's called discursive phenomena. So these are tools to help us identify, analyze, or interpret discourses. So if some of you read the abstract, you might have seen that I talked about passivizing and nominalizing. So passivizing is when we, instead of using an active form of a phrase, we use a passive one. So instead of saying something like, I ate the apple, you might say, the apple was eaten, for example. Nominalization is instead of it's sometimes creating new nouns, but it can also move something from being an object to being the subject. So, for example, in the apple was eaten, the apple became the subject of the phrase rather than I, if that makes sense. If anything doesn't make sense as I'm going, feel free to raise your hand. I'll keep an eye. But I'm happy to take questions as we go. So to talk about passivization, when you move something to being passive, a phrase, language to being passive, a few different things tend to happen. One, the agent gets deleted from the sentence. So who's actually doing the action? That person goes away. And not only do they get deleted, they become impersonal. So you don't really know who they are, what's happening. So when you say, for example, the apple was eaten, you know that there was an agent, but they're not there, and you don't know who they are. There's also a focus on the object. So the apple, the object of the sentence, I ate the apple, moves to a prominent position of the sentence. And then it gives it more prominence, and the person becomes not interesting anymore. And it also does a third thing, which is it changes things that are procedural, processual, into static things. So the passive construction neutralizes doing something active or procedural and makes them static. It makes them, it seems like they're not changeable, they're not alterable, where when you see something in control of an agent, it can still be changed. It seems like it can still be changed, it can still be modified. So when you passivize, you have this other discursive phenomena, which is nominalization. So new nouns tend to be created, or objects tend to become nouns. And you might also get things like compounds which become nouns, or phrases that become nouns. And when this happens, you can also get something called relexicalization, where these new noun compounds become a whole system of compounds that make a sort of specialized jargon, a system of terms that surround this new noun. So I've got an example here which really doesn't show you noun-like compounds, but it's from Newman, Newman's idea of the university, and he has a passive sentence where knowledge has become the noun. So knowledge is called by the name of science or philosophy when it is acted upon, informed, or if I may use a strong figure, impregnated by reason. So it's a nice sentence because it shows you the nominalization of knowledge, and it shows you the deletion of the agent. So who knows what and what's happening. Knowledge is being acted upon, so this really passive phrasing of the verb. So what's happening, rather than someone thinking, reasoning, teaching, learning, deciding, knowing, maybe with someone else, knowledge becomes this static, nominalized, where the action is suppressed, any relationships that might exist are lost between someone and someone else who are agents in this action, this procedure. So that's just an example to see how how discourse tools can be used to think about concepts in when we think about what the university is. So what I said was the actual first thing of the presentation in the original plan, which was the ideas of the university as model. So I really like this theory because it helps us to have a sort of framework to think about what ideas of the university actually are. Well, one way of thinking what they actually are. So Mills, Charles Mills has framed ideal theory as two different types of models. So there's a descriptive model, which is the thing's crucial aspects, its essential nature, and how it actually works, its basic dynamics. Or there's an idealized model of how an ideal version of a thing should work. It can be normatively ideal, it could be technically ideal, and it could be both. So I think it's useful to think about ideas of the university as either or and both and, descriptive and or idealized models of the university. So they tend to incorporate things like what the university is, its essential nature, its purpose, its functions, relationships to society, what it actually is, what it should be, what it actually does, what it should do. So these normative aspects, these descriptive aspects, there's ideals that we hope for, there's recognition of flaws, there's weaknesses. So all of that tends to be, when I looked at different ideas of the university in different literatures, these things tend to show up in different ways. So I suggest that we can understand theoretical ideas of the university as more general models or categories within which the university is typified in different ways. And in philosophy of higher education, often you get books like The Idea of the University, which are straight up theories or ideas or models of the university. In other literatures, sometimes it's a little more hidden, where they talk about the university, what it is, what it should be, but it's not necessarily framed as an idea of the university. So having this framework of ideas as models also helps to sort of gather or bundle these different features that exist within the model, the essential nature, purpose, functions, its relationship to society, and derive sort of other disciplinary ideas of the university that exist, but may not be called as such all the time. I hope that makes sense. Okay, so I thought I would start with some which we might be more familiar with, which are from philosophy of higher education literatures. Newman, Jaspers, Derek Bach, Habermas, all have texts which are either the idea of the university. I think 3 of them are actually called the idea of the university, and one of them is called like the idea beyond the ivory tower. So these have, as you can see, I've bolded a few of the words: liberal or philosophical knowledge, scientific knowledge, systems of knowledges. These do have the noun forms of what could be actions, but they don't really have noun compounds or new noun phrases. And to be fair to Newman and Jaspers, these are a little bit cherry-picked. So around these phrases, these sentences, you have lots of text that's much more active. You see the agents, you see the action, you see the process. Where I think the Bach and the Habermas excerpts give us a little more of what's happening with the noun form of knowledge. So the Bach quote, "Americans tend to look on higher education as a means for providing the knowledge and trained manpower that a rapidly developing society required." So it's a noun form of knowledge. It deletes any agents. We don't really know what the procedure is. The second one, must the university, on its way towards functional specialization within an ever more swiftly differentiating system of knowledges, discard what had once been called its idea? So even in Habermas, where and to be fair, he's German, and of course, they write a lot in passive, so it's not entirely fair in the translation in English, that is kind of passive. But anyway, still, the system of knowledges excludes an agent, it excludes relationships, it excludes a lot of other aspects of what academic knowledge might consist of if we had it framed in a different way. I think it's a good introduction to applying the discursive phenomena, but I think we see a lot more of its use when we look at other disciplines. So when we look, or fields. So when we look in international higher education, for example, we have some more interesting and weird noun forms or noun phrases or compounds. The knowledge economy, the global knowledge economy, creating new knowledge, knowledge hubs, transfer of knowledge, geography of scientific knowledge and collaboration. So if we look at the first one from Altbach, given the centrality of the knowledge economy, higher education has assumed a higher profile within countries internationally because of its role in educating people for the new economy, creating new knowledge. The global knowledge economy has become a central reality, and universities, especially research universities, are very much engaged. So if we think about things like the knowledge economy, creating new knowledge, and the the role of new noun forms and nouns that, because they're so standardized, they're so unitary, they tend to remain a bit unanalyzed in terms of what they would be if they were active or procedural, if they weren't static. What do they actually mean? Creating new knowledge, for example. What does new knowledge even mean? What's new? Or if we think about the second one from Tilak, which is from, I think, a UNESCO document, which he wrote about the General Agreement on Trade and Services. He says, the other gains claim to include cross-cultural linkages and possible transfer of knowledge and technology, as internationalization can lead universities to becoming more involved in collaborative research with offshore institutions. So this is, again, kind of weird if we actually think about the concept of transfer of knowledge. How do you transfer knowledge? Is this something that we can objectify and pick up and move across borders? These are the kinds of questions that when we see a noun form of a thing that we're accustomed to seeing, we sort of ignore what other implications there might be for what the university is and what the university is doing in this exchange. So developmental higher education literature also has some interesting compounds. The dissemination of new knowledge, newly created knowledge, diffusion of knowledge, how new knowledge is created by research universities, but also within firms, government agencies, and universities worldwide. I like that phrase, new knowledge is created by research at research universities, because you see with the second part of the phrase, also by firms, government agencies, and universities, that what the university is implicitly in that sentence has changed a bit, because now we're kind of the same as government agencies and firms. We do the same thing. Is there something different about being a university? Because we seem to create new knowledge just like firms and government agencies. So what this language does is that it sort of obscures or hides what the university is underneath. So it's changing what the university is just with that linguistic choice of using a noun form or a noun compound, a noun phrase. Yeah. So development policy is a whole other bucket where you see all kinds of fabulous phrasings about what you can do with knowledge. So I've picked a few from the World Bank and UNESCO from different documents. These from the World Bank, for example, produce, select, adapt, commercialize, and use knowledge. So if we actually think about that, how do you select knowledge? How do you produce knowledge? How do you use knowledge? What does it mean to do those things? Knowledge has become the most important factor in economic development. Economic growth is as much a process of knowledge accumulation as of capital accumulation. So you can have an image in your mind of, like, collecting gold coins like Scrooge McDuck, in a huge pile. But what do you do with knowledge? Is it my home with like 70,000 books in it? What is knowledge accumulation? What does that look like? So there's all kinds of weird images and noun compounds that are created that we assume that we treat as perfectly acceptable in policy. When you think about policy, what it's actually supposed to do is something active. What could it possibly mean? Process of knowledge accumulation. It's quantified, so it has to be something measurable. What are they measuring? They're not measuring the number of books we have. What are they measuring? So we can start asking these questions when we think about how the notion of academic knowledge is shaped within these phrases, within these noun compounds. There's a couple of other fun ones. From the World Bank again. The second dimension of change in education and training needs is the short shelf life of knowledge. Again, if we think about it, what does that mean? So it's become just another product at the supermarket, which, like the yogurt, only lasts a week and then you have to throw it away. That's hilarious. That's actually hilarious. But we just let it be. So then the second one, the scientific technological revolution therefore places problems of knowledge and training in an entirely new light, giving men entirely new possibilities of thought and action. For the first time, it's truly universal. That one sounds pretty good. How is the scientific technological revolution, has it actually changed the power dynamics in universalizing knowledge? Does everyone have access to knowledge now? Is academic knowledge any less restricted, or is there any less marginalization in the university than what it was before? So we see these problems, it goes both ways, of either making it look really shiny or making it look terrible, but what it does is it effectively changes what the university is, what the university is doing, in the sort of hidden ideas of the university underneath policy, underneath the theory work that we do. Okay, another layer. Because I've had the good fortune to work with people who are actually doing philosophy of higher education, I've got to read a lot more philosophy than I had done before. And those people who I talk to regularly know I've been reading a ton of Bergson lately. So this work by Henri Bergson on real time, real duration. He says, real duration is that duration which gnaws on things and leaves on them the mark of its tooth. If everything is in time, everything changes inwardly, and the same concrete reality never recurs. I like this concept of time. He opposes it to time in measured time, so whether that's scientific measurements or the way we treat time otherwise. And what I think is useful about putting those things in tension, measured time and real time, is because I think it gives us an opportunity to think about the effect of treating knowledge in the noun form as a unitary fixed object, effectively, something with a short shelf life, something that we can transfer across borders, something that contributes to economic growth. So knowledge becomes something static, staid, passive, isolated. There's no agent involved. It's fixed. Is it written fixed? I don't know. It's objectifiable. It's commodifiable. You can trade it. You can possess it. Whether we can think about academic knowledge in that way, we could talk about that. I don't mean exactly to comment on what knowledge is in academia, but I think that putting it next to treating knowledge in real time in academic knowledge, there are elements that we can think about. The agent, certainly, but knowing as something alive, active. There's cyclical communication. If we think about what we actually do in the university, it's conversations, it's teaching, it's feedback, it's maybe there is some dissemination to society, but it's always moving, where we can never say, oh, we found the truth, the answer. This is the knowledge that we need forever and ever, or the knowledge that applies to this problem perfectly. It's always building on something. It's always moving, developing. It's dependent on an agent. It's dependent on a disciplinary community. It rides on 1,000 years of thinking. It's not necessarily something that we can treat in this way that's static, passive, isolated, fixed. And I don't think something that we can really treat as an object in the way that using the noun knowledge tends to make it perceived that way. So I'm coming to the end. And I think maybe I talked a little fast, but that's okay. So it left me with some questions. So what is the university? So if we go back to the Charles Mills descriptive and ideal models, with its essence, with its dynamics, with its functions, its purpose, its relationship to society, for the essence of something that holds knowledge as fixed inside of it, which I think when we look at least the international higher ed and the development higher education theory, and certainly the policy, we see something that holds knowledge in the essence, in its essence. So the university becomes a knowledge university. It creates new knowledge. It trains human capital. It transfers knowledge to the national economy. It transfers knowledge across borders. And I think Andrew and Son's work on the flattened policy ontology sort of reflects that kind of effect. The opposite might be if we look at more active forms of what happens in the university. Certainly we see this in a lot of the literature in philosophy of higher education, or maybe teaching, pedagogy. We see it when we think about the different agents within actors, supervisors, students, doctoral students, undergraduate experiences. You see that it's much more community oriented. There's activity, there's communication, there's dialogue. So the university, rather in its essence, it doesn't have knowledge, but it has a community. And that allows it to also be in time, and not only in time right now in the present, but connected to the past and connected to the future. So it's a community in communication and dialogue doesn't have to be fixed. It doesn't have to be stayed. It can be in movement. So that way the functions become active, thinking, searching, researching, conversing, discussing, writing, etc. So I think that's the kind of relationship I had for the concept of knowledge as it's used in theory, in disciplinary work, in policy, versus if we think about it as in its active form and what that distinction might be. I think bringing in time also helps because it forces us to see what happens when we pluck knowledge out of time. It becomes something that we can't objectify. When we put it in time, it has to be active, it has to be connective. It's hard to treat it as something tradable, possessible, or objectifiable in that way. Thank you.
Thank you, Tessa, very much. I very much appreciated your presentation. I think you gave us also a lot of this kind of focus that our conversation might sometimes lack. Tending more to the abstract. So it was really really nice that you brought us a bit to some particular examples and showed us how your thinking worked in them. I'm sure there are questions. I have some myself, but now I would like to open the floor to other participants. And if you would like to make a comment, pose a question to Tessa, please don't hesitate. Maybe use an raise hand button within Zoom, and yeah, I would like to invite you all to join this conversation.
Soren?
Yes, there is a question from Soren.
I don't need to start, but I can start. But just thanking you, Tessa, for a brilliant presentation. It's very rich and nuanced, and all the different languages that you present are very interesting. And I wonder how you see it, if all the languages are equally real, because you say it's about ontology. So are they equally real, or some more real than others? And if the first is the case, if they're equally real, then the university must be everything that you mention and all the languages. So it seems to be maybe in conflict with itself, because some of the languages seems to be in conflict with one another. So I'm just wondering how you see that. Maybe that's a very sort of, I don't know, scholastic, traditional ontological question, but I still wonder about it because I'm still sort of trying to figure out the notion of the real in relation to language, if that makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you. It does. I don't know if I can answer it properly, but there are different versions of this answer, I guess, depending on who you talk to. I think that language is real. I think languages are, if we think about the languages, what we talked about in the presentation, equally real, some more real than others, I don't know. But I think it's okay that they're in conflict. I think that's part of what it is in a university. Being in a university is, we all come in, I think Newman says something like, it's okay if you rub shoulders against each other, we're all, heading in a similar direction, or we're seeking something. And that's all right. And it's part of being a university. I'm not concerned about, I guess, in terms of the reality, I think Paul Ricoeur says that discourse allows us to get at the being of being. So I don't know if it's real in itself, but it allows us to access that reality in a way. access the essence. And I think that maybe it's seen as one of the paths, at least for humans, to access that. On the other hand, I guess, who was it? I guess it was when I was reading Simone Weil the other day. There's also an accessing of what's real in a nonverbal. So the nonverbal is something that you could do to access reality, but I guess discourse and language allow us to do it in a way that's maybe more communal. Can we do it non-verbally together? I don't know. And because the university is, at least I see it as something that's communal, we need language to be able to access what's real together. Does that kind of get at some of what you were asking?
That's a great point. I look forward to explore that more, that sort of that it becomes real in the maybe the dialoguing together. And yeah, thanks a lot. I'll think further.
I already seen Andrew raising hand. There is also a question from Ron. So Andrew, would you like to join us?
I'll defer to Ron. Ron kept his hand up for longer, so he means it.
Okay, then Ron.
Well, thank you very much for what a stimulating talk this morning, where I am anyway. And it's made me think, which is wonderful. Basque, as we know, sharply differentiated the realms of epistemology from ontology, and it was part of his central part of his philosophy that we keep them separate. But Tessa has shot an exocet through all of that this morning, because Tessa has implicitly shown us that epistemology can become ontological. That is to say, it can take on a real force of its own. And I think this is where we get a beginnings of an answer, if I can say so, to Soren's question, that different forms of knowledge take on different force in the world and take on different, if you like, realities in the world. And as Tessa was implying with some of those quotations from Bock and so forth, not the philosophers, that epistemology, knowledge has become a productive force in cognitive capitalism, a major force, but only some knowledges. So the part of the role of the university is to differentiate, demarcate, and legitimize knowledge. And it classifies knowledge, and it says some are more legitimate than others. So we've got all this crisis of the humanities, which counterbalances the privileging that universities are giving to the sciences. All of this is to say, as I say, that knowledge, and I think it's very interesting what Tessa's had to say, because it's made me see this relationship between epistemology and ontology very much intertwined, and but in a very nuanced way. And I think there's if I can say so, there's a lot here that we need to go on building on. So I just want to thank Tessa. I don't know whether you want to comment on anything I've just said, because I don't really have a nice question for you, I'm afraid, except that, would you agree that knowledge takes on, through the university, differential ontological statuses?
I don't know. I'm still thinking about when you said that I've shot an arrow between knowledge and ontology and epistemology, and I'm like, did I? Is that what I meant to do? I don't know. I don't know if that's what I meant to do. I think there's still two stages with when you think about discourse and discourse use. I think this is also related to Sen's question. Maybe this will help answer it more. That discourse, I think, has an ontological element, but then there's epistemological implications, which are more the use of it, and also the analysis and hermeneutics, where I'm not sure, where I think you're right. There's something to what you're saying, Ron, with whether different knowledges have different ontological, forces in the university. I don't know. I think that's also, knowledge can be used, I think, as a medium of, or discourse can be used as a medium of power. And so it has ontological implications, or it has implications, it affects reality, it affects society. But I'm not sure if they have, how we would qualify which has more than something else, which I think Sun was also asking, which languages are some more real than others. I think it's a similar sort of question. Do some have more ontological force than others? I don't know. Maybe someone else can answer that question.
I can maybe add just a little bit before we move to other questions. I think what you are discussing here is quite the general tendency within contemporary philosophy that it's becoming increasingly hard to produce this kind of rupture between ontology and epistemology, right? We so often talk now about sort of onto-epistemic nodes, right, in our thinking, showcasing that ontology and epistemology collide with each other. And even if we try to force them into, separate brackets, they're sort of, going beyond them and mixing in something that is very much a node rather than two separate problems. And I think this kind of problems that the two of you posed is an illustration of this more general trend that we are trying to grasp and make sense of still to this day. Yeah, but so I already see that there are two more questions from Franek and one from Iris. Andrew, would you like to add something to the conversation? Because I'm not sure whether you wanted to pose a question or not.
I'll get in the queue after Lily.
All right. Okay. So it's Franek, then to Iris, and then Lily, and finally we will move to Andrew. Franek, you are with us. Okay, great.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thanks for really interesting presentation. I really like how clearly you showed like this difference between like two ways of like describing like knowledge in like concrete documents and like concrete like discourses. And I was like thinking like yeah, like but I think it posed for me like many questions also about like further implications of like such division. And I was thinking like, have you were considering little deeper how this division can be connected with some like subordinating power of knowledge? And I was thinking about like the one quote, I can like put it in the chat like in a minute, from Edward Said, when he's like describing like Orientalist knowledge as some kind of like Platonic essence, and it is like very much as you are describing this like knowledge that is like produced, that is like in this known form, that and he means like that, like for him like Orientalist knowledge is Platonic essence because it is like it cannot be actually changed when it is met with some like experience. So if someone have like this Orientalist knowledge about Egypt, like anything that Egyptian will do or will say won't like change actually this like essence of like knowledge about the Egypt. And I was thinking like is this like whole discourse about producing some like very stable knowledge, this like knowledge that we can like put in some like safe, like we can accumulate as money, etc. Is it also like somehow connected to like subordinating aspect of that knowledge?
Thanks, Brennick. That's a great question. And I think there is a relationship there. So when in the text that I used to, I referenced for the discursive phenomena, passivization and nominalization, he was actually a journalist. And so it was from that realm of analysis. And the text is actually called Language and Control. So it's through the deletion of agents, through the passivization and making things static that are actually procedural, by eliminating us asking questions about the new nouns, by treating those whole semantic realms as sort of a jargon, you have more control. It's for example, I think there was one about expelling someone from school. Usually that's written in a passive form, like expelling the student was done on this date. It doesn't tell you anything about who was expelling, why they're expelling the student, etc. So the authority becomes sort of hidden in these sort of passivized formations of language. You don't know who the authority is, but it's written in an authoritative way, and it allows for control because of its framing and because of the way the nouns are formed, as hidden, as being something that's accepted, not questioned. Yeah, there is a relationship, I think, to the work of Said. I like his text as well, but I think there's because he also uses knowledge again in the framing of it. There's maybe a loss a little bit of agency and relationship. So let's say someone has Orientalist knowledge. You could go to Egypt and experience something and change, or you could not. I don't think it's fixed that way, but I think if you treat it as knowledge again, as something fixed, then you might tend not to change. But if you treat it as something that's in movement, there's more space for experience to shape someone's what they know. I don't know. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah. Thanks very much. Yeah, super interesting.
Okay, so Iris, if you would like to join us, please do so.
Yeah, thanks, Tessa. This was very interesting and inspiring. It also gives a lot of there's a lot of thoughts going on, and I really like the approach that he took and sort of spelling out how it goes with language. What I found interesting, and maybe I missed it in all the quotes that you presented, is traditionally knowledge is connected to truth or true beliefs, and there's nothing in these quotes about finding the truth. And that also made me think about Ron's comment. So perhaps what we see in the university is that the sciences, as opposed to the humanities, have this promise of giving us the truth, or like more truths about the world than the humanities does. So maybe that's where there's this sort of ontological distinction, where the sciences have this larger status of giving truth, even though that might not necessarily actually be true. So that's just a thought I had. And maybe something else what you showed in the slide on the Charles Mills models of the Charles Mills slide on models of universities. It almost sounded like the university had a kind of teleological function, so that its essence, it's defining futures, it's sort of like flourishing in society. So I don't know what your thoughts were on that, or if that's something you would like to respond.
Thank you. I think the reason there wasn't truth on the slides is because I wasn't trying to analyze knowledge itself as a concept, but rather the use of knowledge in ideas of university. However, it is kind of interesting to think about which disciplines might tend to fix knowledge more as something static and immovable and transferable. and whether that contributes to what I think Ron was saying earlier, which ones have more force ultimately. So perhaps there's a perception of some forms of academic knowledge as being more fixed, more truthful, and those tend to have more force because they are objectifiable, because they are commodifiable, if you treat them that way. But I wonder, though, if you talk to scientists, whether they would acknowledge that. I don't think so. When I have talked to scientists, most of them are much more comfortable with the theoretical and hypothetical forms of their work when you have conversations. But certainly when it's transferred to policy, you see language that suggests that it can be perceived that way. And if it's perceived that way, then certainly it would have more effect in that way. For the teleological end of the university, I don't know. I didn't think about that. I'm not sure. I don't think I can answer that. If someone else has an idea of whether that's so, please do respond. Anyone?
Okay, maybe let's for now make a pause on it. Yeah, Lily, if you would like to join, please.
Thank you. And thank you, Tessa, for the very interesting and inspiring sharing. I really like the way that you look at different scholars and in different subfields in terms of how they talk about knowledge in relation to university. So this is something that has been puzzling me for a long time. I know we talked about it earlier, that there isn't a lot of discussion or studying on how do scholars or research from non-Western world talk about knowledge and as well as university, the idea of university. Because the idea of university currently in higher education studies, we tend to see it as a universal, because modern universities, at least to a large extent, if we look at the institutions, then it turns to be like similar, particularly with research intensive universities. But then in fact, if we look at how university operates in different contexts, we see that there is a need to look for more sort of diverse ways of looking at the idea of university, ideas of university, and then perhaps there could be related different ways of looking at knowledge. I know that this may not be a part of your current study, but I'm just wondering, have you thought about it? And this is again related to our early conversation about language, because we know that language provides like ground the hermeneutic horizon, the space, like language is part of it. If like you were talking about nominalization and passivity of the discourse, if we use the similar strategy in the Chinese language, that wouldn't make that much sense in a way. So I'm just wondering, and I think this is related to the earlier question from Soren, that what is real and what not real. Just want to hear your thoughts about this, moving beyond like one potential horizon, like multiple horizons, and how we may move things forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Lily. That's super interesting questions. Maybe I'll start with the last one first, on how different spoken languages or written languages have different grammatical syntax and shapes and phrases. And I think by and large, discourse analysis as a method tends to be for either English or Latin-based languages. So that's certainly a recognized weakness of that form of analysis. But thinking more about what you were saying about non-Western ideas of the university and the way knowledge is presented, one thing that I have looked into before is secularism. So the way secularism is treated in the West and the way it's treated in more Eastern or Southern contexts is quite distinct, and that affects the kinds of knowledges that are incorporated typically or acceptable in academia. So, for example, in Eastern contexts, typically secular knowledge can include more religious or spiritual knowledge as part of what counts as academic knowledge, where sometimes you see in Western contexts, those tend to be excluded when they say university is secular knowledge. And so there's that distinction in what gets included as knowledge in the first place. And I think that would affect what we see in terms of the ideas of the university and what role the concept of knowledge plays in it. Because even what's included and counted as being worthy of being academic knowledge, I think is distinct in different contexts. I hope that answered your question. Andrew?
Desperately trying to click unmute. Thank you very much for that, Tessa, and although your responses to all the questions have been whittling down my own thoughts. So thank you everyone else for their questions too. First observation I would just say is I just wanted to say about the Newman thing is it's interesting to compare Newman, who was, you know, writing in Dublin when he was talking about these kinds of things. His model was to be an actual model for an institution. But it's interesting to compare to someone like Humboldt, because Humboldt did actually manage, it'd be interesting to look at the language in a discourse analysis sense. But the language he was using was the language of process, and it was the language of community, and it was his vision of knowledge was very different. It seemed more, because it was research focused, he was able to kind of capture that process bit. So that's an interesting project to look at. But you got me thinking about the notion of a tool, right? Because you're talking about these two discursive phenomena as tools, and we use tools with a goal in mind. I think it's coming through here that the goal is critical, largely speaking, where it's being able to critique something. And I was just wondering, you know, the other side of critique is, you know, when we move on, it's moving into construction. So critical construction. And I was just wondering, you know, what's your critical construction coming out of this? Because it's kind of, should we, instead of passivizing, are we moving into the space of activating? And instead of nominalization, are we talking about verbification or adverbalizing or what? You know, I'm just wondering for yourself, you know, how has this changed what you're looking at and how you're looking at it? Because it seems to be a very powerful tool that people have identified. So for yourself, you know, how is this ontology affecting your research and what you're doing? That's what I'm interested in. Where are you going with?
For the Humboldt, I think one of the reasons he's not up there is because his language tends to be much more active in general in the text. So I did look at Humboldt, but I didn't include it. As far as tools and critique and critical construction go, I think what these are useful for is opening things that look like they're closed or fixed. I don't think it's necessarily that we switch to activation of everything or adverbialization or what have you, but it allows us to see things and ask questions about what else is happening. So it just opens something that has been perceived as being closed. For example, if we look at the development higher education language, or even the international higher education language, the re-lexicalization, the whole jargon, the system of words that surround this notion of using knowledge as a concept and academic knowledge as a concept, it all seems very fixed. It all seems in place. It's all functional. It's functional to the point of being very much in policy. I've been looking at Danish university visions and missions and strategies for the past few months. It's all over the place, this kind of language use. So it's down to the institutional level. It's down to the department level. So the what's valuable about these tools, I don't think is necessarily a shift in the way we construct sentences, but a shift in the way we perceive what is and isn't fixed. So maybe the Bergson time, the real time layer that I brought in, I think that's useful for me. So seeing time as continuous, seeing the past, present, and future as gnawing on each other, that ontological vision of reality, that shapes the way I think I then see language being used. And it also, then the tools allow me to ask, well, what's happening if we move this to real time? So what's actually happening there? What's what's not being said, who isn't there, what does this look like? So I think that's what the tools do. I don't think I would advocate for activating everything, because I think there's still it's a functional term, academic knowledge. It works, but I think as long as we're able to ask questions of what it means in terms of agencies and procedures, what it means to be in movement, what's things that decisions can be made, things can be changed. Those, the way of seeing the world as something changeable, something changing, I think is what I would hope to get out of using these tools. If that makes sense.
Okay, any further questions? Andrew made a very, very good question. This was actually something that I wanted to ask you about, because I also recognize strong critical potential of your proposition, but I was interested in hearing more about this sort of positive, affirmative side of your critical project. I now understand it more. However, if I can maybe add something to the conversation you had with Andrew, when you presenting when you were presenting your ideas, well, for me at least, like some already critical discourse resonated with me greatly. For example, Bourdieu and scholastic disposition, or Donna Haraway's situated knowledge, in terms, you know, that this kind of passivization, nominalization very much produced this sort of subject position that is very much outside the object which, you know, she tried to grasp. So I think once we question it, there is an interesting question in your proposition about the, you know, the subjectivization of the, you know, subject of knowledge also, and maybe in these terms also ontology is making, you know, sort of back way into the whole discussion. Yeah, but this is just a comment. I see that David also wanted to add something to what we are talking about.
Thanks. Thanks, Tessa, for this presentation. I'm having fun at this point reading a book by Peter Burke called Ignorance. And he comes very close in the way he's developing this book to argue that the function of universities and science and so on is actually to produce ignorance. Because in the struggle to try to understand the way things work, we actually end up uncovering a great deal more that we don't understand than that we actually do. And the way you framed this made me think of what he's arguing in a slightly different way. Ignorance seems to call you to action. It seems to require the active voice. Whereas the way, and I think you're right, the way knowledge is being portrayed is it's a done deal. It's already in a box and you just reach up on the shelf and pull some of it off. So this framing about a kind of battle between knowledge and ignorance as the venue in which a university operates, and other places, it's not unique to universities, obviously, but it's an interesting way to try to frame this and to get the active voice back into it. So I think I recommend Burke. It's a lot of fun. He has a lot of examples of horrific ignorance, of course, and given the political campaigns that we're watching, he certainly has plenty to work with.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I will look it up. I think I was drawn more to what you were saying is ignorance as a call to action. That's really interesting. So as being in the university as something that creates a gap or an emptiness or something that you want to fill, that you have a desire to fill, or you're motivated to fill, you're moved. That's really interesting. I'll certainly look it up. Thank you. And I saw your comments as well. I'll look at that text. Richard Lanham, thank you.
All right. Any other questions? Any other comments? We still have maybe a bit of time, but it's up to us how we make use of it.
Well, I might add one other thing. There's a book by Caroline Levine called The Activist Humanist. It's a fairly recent book. She's from Cornell University, but I've never met her, so I retired apparently before she showed up. She is an English lit professor, and came up through critical theory and so on, and has become really very critical of critical theory. And I think I'm raising it because I think it connects to Tessa's argument. She talks about the way in which critical theorists have managed to make exploding things, breaking them up, questioning them, an end point rather than a beginning point. That there's this kind of self-canceling quality to the way the critique is laid out, and that fits very well with your active voice concern. And it's a very sustained argument that she makes, and she's really trying to force her community, which is not noted for its activism, to start thinking more about what in fact are they learning from the literary studies that they are engaged with that's of any use to anybody, as life tools, as social change. It's not one agenda, but it's a quite atypical take. And I mean, I knew 30 years worth of the critical theorists at my university, and they were not what you would call an activist group, except in talking.
I too have heard the criticism of the critical theorists and saying that it's been around for 50, 60 years and nothing's changed. What's the point?
She's trying to get at that there's no necessity that critical theory be an endpoint that stops any kind of action. And that's perhaps even a perversion of the idea, domestication of the idea.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting.
But maybe the question is not like, it shouldn't be framed like either we need passivization or activization. Maybe there is, some dialectical relation, and maybe it's more about, negotiating what we actually need in terms of the goals that we are pursuing. That might be might also be a case, right? When for example, your thinking, reveals, some avenues in which we can for sure, see that this leads to, as you also observed, to commodification of knowledge, right? To making some kind of sellable product. There might be some areas when we can, move more towards activization than passivization. Maybe we can play, dialectically with those two poles. Just an idea. Soren, would you like to add something?
Yeah, I really look forward to also following up on and I appreciate all these different comments, and I'm sort of trying to, panically note down a lot of the great things that are being said by everyone here. And I really look forward to also hear more about that community dimension, or get back to that, Tessa, at some point. I don't know if you want to think further now, but maybe at a later point, that it seemed to be that the more we know, the less self-sufficient we become. So it's warped, or it's a sort of a strange form of autonomy at work here. It's not at least a self-sufficient, self-relying form of autonomy, but it's a more, vulnerable or interdependent understanding of autonomy, which is a paradox, or what? If the result of autonomy is actually to become more interdependent, because the more we know, the more we need each other, which is it's a strange logic perhaps, but I sense that is sort of lurking in your argument as well, that could perhaps be unfolded more, maybe not necessarily now, but perhaps at a later point. I don't know. What do you think?
I'm not sure yet. I was thinking about the breaking things and not breaking things, and I was thinking also about the verbal and the nonverbal with the community, and some of the work that Sun and I and TJ and Andrew, and I think Ron also, we've been working on with the humanities and what the ontology of the humanities might be is with encounter, so being with other things. And I'm wondering about that with the notion of community and the university. Is there a being with in a nonverbal sense, as well as a verbal sense, whether those things are both parts of being in community in the university? I'll have to think about it more, but it was something that struck me with there's been so many comments and they're all sort of, I'm like, oh, this idea and that. But yeah, I'm not sure. I think there's something there because it allows for the agency. But I think it's, yeah, the being together with, whether it's through communication or not, might be something to play with as in the essence part of what the university is. Yeah, for future, for sure.
All right. I hope that there will be plenty of occasions, to carry this conversation forward. Next will be in February, and we will stay actually in the theme of knowledge and ontology, because our main speaker will be Martin Go from Liverpool University, and he will also speak about ontology in relation to the problem of knowledge. So there will be, I think, a good transition from today's conversations towards what yet to come. I would like to thank you all for participation in today's event. As I said, we will be having regular seminars each month until the summer break. So look forward to emails from probably from Tessa informing you about new events. And as I said, on 26th of February we'll be meeting again. So thank you very much for today, and I wish you a pleasant day. Thank you
very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Kuba.
Thank you, Tessa. It was really great to have you here and listen to your ideas. Really appreciate it, and I very much look forward, to reading it developed into a chapter project. Yeah,
it's on my list. Put it the next.
Absolutely. I'll do my best to help you with it and get it done.
Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to seeing everyone in June.
I'm very happy that we build this group and we are having this conversation. So yeah, have a pleasant day and see you soon.
Bye
bye.